Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the lighthouse of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka no, we will not be covering the new Lamp of Murmur.
And I'm the black metal guy, aka the Virgin Lamp of Murmur versus the Chad Murmuüre. I don't know whether they were referring to the same. Maybe it's in some fantasy book or something, or some sort of highbrow cultural reference point that neither of us understands. But yes, they have virtually the same name. There is a relatively little known. I think they got better known in the last 5 years or something. But there's a project called Murmuüre, M-U-R-M-U-U umlaut R-E, from France that just came out a long, long time ago, I think in 2010, and got picked up by sort of like early like literal hipster black metal type people, but was touted as like, oh, radical, innovative black metal, but was clearly an industrial record. And this is a really, really good band. Whereas Lamp of Murmur is not. So I say we check it out. Yeah, so what do you make of that?
Well, that's interesting. I think I heard it, at least bits of it, when it first came out in 2010. It reminds me of when the very first kind of post-black stuff was starting, but, you know, before that was refined into an idea. It was just kind of a catch-all term for weird kind of black metal-y stuff that has a lot of influences from outside. So it reminds me a little bit of, like, the really early stuff by Kana or something like that. Who I should probably go back to. I remember that early Kana stuff was actually pretty cool. But it sounds really contemporary. Like, that could come out today and we'd cover it, you know?
Yeah, it was very out of its time. It got all this black metal buzz, but was structurally, it really is written as a sort of arty post-industrial thing. And unlike a lot of stuff that like flails at you saying, "Look how arty I am," or like, "I'm not like the other black metals," this has a method to it in the way that a lot of the best kind of abstract art does. It was he recorded a bunch. There were a bunch of improv recordings of guitar, maybe with drums also, but I think maybe just guitar improvisations that he then cut up like the reason it sounds so scrambled and backwards and yet organic and intuitive and flowing is there was original black metal-ish or skullflower-ish guitar improv that then got sort of like glitched to fuck.
Yeah, sort of old, like, cut and paste tape loop kind of methodology.
Yeah. And obviously, like, it's also just like a power guitar answer to Coil. And in fact, I looked, he has a Metal Archives picture now. I guess it's been successful enough. And the picture is him in a fucking Coil shirt holding a stick, looking shamanic in front of a dolmen. Or maybe it's a tree, but he's making it look like a Menhir for sure. Anyway, you have something you wanted to play.
Yeah, sure. Something actually from this year. So, real quick, this came out last month, but I figured it was worth playing on the show. So, a band that we talk about a lot on the show is Brodequin, who are a brutal death band from like the late 90s and early 2000s that have a lot to offer, like black metal and war metal people. It's definitely not standard for what you might imagine when you hear that genre description. And, they've recently reformed with kind of a new lineup, and I think they have a full-length record coming soon. But last month they released a 2-track little promo EP called The Perpetuation of Suffering. So it's just a couple short songs, so we will listen to the first one called Seven Nails. So I know Brodequin back in the day was one of the first kind of brutal death bands that caught your ear as someone who doesn't usually listen to the style. So what do you think of the new stuff?
Oh, it's even more accessible to someone who doesn't. Yeah, I remember what struck me back in the day was just that it was raw sound, not clicky in the way that often afflicted brutal death back in the early teens or in the 00s. But raw, not clicky, and the riffing was just simpler, just massive, heavy palm mute stuff, very fast. And it spoke to the side of me that just liked Marduk and Diocletian and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And also it had the added thing of being about super brutal shit, medieval torture, without just having, I don't know, like sort of gore porn splattered all over the cover, which just, isn't really my thing.
It's tasteful medieval gore porn.
Tasteful medieval gore porn. Although, honestly, if you look at some of those, dude, that one Defeated Sanity record, if you look at some of that medieval gore porn, it's like, oh, shit.
Like chapters and fragments, yeah.
Yeah, this one has a guy getting this Brodequin one has a looks like a bishop having a screw put into his eye. So that's pretty fucking brutal. But yeah, so this is sort of, the production is cleaned up, and the riffing, we've talked on this show before about how, in a way, the best of thrash metal, or the real development of thrash metal into cutting-edge extreme metal, in some ways, or at least one of the avenues, really is into brutal and technical death metal. Mm-hmm. This sounds even more thrashy than their old stuff.
Yeah, I was surprised when I heard this at just how kind of thrash-oriented these riffs are. Specifically, it's like it ties a lot to maybe like Vader. I heard a lot of Vader in that, as well as the Marduk. I mean, just that. That's a pure, yeah.
Zero, like 1, 0, 3, 4, 3, 0, which
half the best death metal riffs are made of that.
Oh, so. Sure. Yeah, it's all just rearrangement of Elemental Slayer type stuff, right? But but yeah, it really does. And also just the root, the use of pedal point technique from thrash, where you're sweeping from the root to the octave in a setting that's blast beat based, right? Yeah. Is a very, very Marduk thing. Vader, also from that era, Behemoth and Chrysian, right?
Yeah, Chrysian definitely, I could see.
Chrysian we could also class as a brutal death band, right?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, because it really was just playing kind of Morbid Angel songs way too fast and tuned way too low,
If you're interested in hearing more about Chrysian and Vader, we have a bonus episode where we talk about both of them.
Well, speaking of bonus episodes, what a wonderful segue, Black Metal Guy. Housekeeping, up top, as usual. Social media, me on Facebook, at Terminus Podcast, and the Black Metal Guy on Instagram, at Terminus Extreme Metal. And then if you want to hear about stuff like Vader or Chrysian, you could support us on Patreon or Subscribestar for access to the Terminus Prime bonus episodes for only $3 a month. So that gets you access to all of the cataloged bonus episodes, where we usually concentrate on, older records that are part of kind of our personal canon of classics. We do some obvious stuff and some less obvious stuff, but we focus a lot on history there. Our last episode that does a deep dive into some of our favorite stuff from the Canadian war metal scene, and it's not the bands that are immediately coming to mind. Just came out a couple weeks ago, so something to look forward to there. And then if you go for $5 and up, you get access to the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server, where we can talk about just about any topic. Usually I have a bit here, but this is our second time trying to record this episode, so we're just...
Are we also adding voting privileges for the $10 and up people?
Yes, we are. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, $10 and up.
If you attain the Patreon rank of Proletarian Death Row, you can vote on, which bands we cover for the bonus episodes.
Yes, that is true. We've just started instituting that, even though we promised that we were doing that for like a year. Now we're actually doing it. All right, big episode today. Lots of records I love. Lots of records that you really like, apart from one, and it'll be the obvious one, but whatever. But you've got...
People will be surprised by that. In their own way, that'll be a surprise. Or in its own way, that'll be a surprise.
So, first half of the episode's yours. What have we got?
Well, we start off with Ascetic, by a band from Australia called Norse. This is out on Transcending Obscurity, the prolific and, generous death metal label. A bunch of their stuff is always pay what you want. Big on Bandcamp. Norse caught my ear a few years back when they released a very weird record that was something like hyper blasting black metal wired through the most modern elements of beatdown, breakdown, gent music in a way. So obviously something that spans all sides of the Terminus aesthetic and that we need to check out. Next up is Hegemonikon, with a K, of course, by Solitvdo, with a V, of course. Solitvdo. That's makes it more Roman. Out on Aeternitas Tenebrarum Motherfucker, or whatever ATMF stands for. But ATMF, the Italian label. And this is sort of noble Italian solar metal in the tradition of Spite Extremewing. Obviously, we are covering this.
Of course. Eventually people get tired of us talking about Spite, but we won't stop even then.
No, they will surrender.
Absolutely, to the might of Rome. So, second half of the episode, very different mood starts occurring. So, opening the first half of the episode is a band that I featured on a news segment maybe 2 or 3 months ago, and that is the debut record by 357 Homicide, titled Executed on Sight, available now on Vile Tapes Records. This is a 2-man slam band from Manchester, England, and they they work with a resolute purity of vision and execution that will be very fun to talk about. And then wrapping up today's episode,
just it sucks. I hate it.
Well, I love it. So, I know it's completely self-indulgent. I'm not going to convert anyone on this, but I just really wanted to cover it. And then wrapping up today's episode is going to be out of absolutely nowhere, with basically no promotion or fanfare, the first new full-length record in 14 years by Lymphatic Phlegm, titled Roughly Excised, Putrefindings, Morbidescriptions, and Necronoses, out on Black Hole Productions. Lymphatic Phlegm is one of the weirdest and most unique gore grind bands that really there's ever been. They are now a quarter century old this year since the release of their first demo. And while I'm sure a lot of our regular listener base are inclined to click away before they get to the gore grind record, stick around. It's very different. It has a lot to offer.
It's really good. All right. And we are leading off with Ascetic by Norse, out on Transcending Obscurity Records, or Productions, or whatever it is. Norse is a Australian black metal band, I think, that started as, I think it's black metal, that started as sort of relatively technical, hyper-blasting black metal, and very quickly started gravitating toward the more industrial end of the spectrum, and trying to looking for versions of industrial that were not just, as we've talked about lately, that were different from the 90s and early 2000s version of just putting mechanized blast beats under black metal, or putting ministry dance beats in black metal.
Yeah.
And the way they did that was unexpected. They went towards the sort of clanging, inorganic, kind of beefy, sub-bass heavy sound in like gent and beatdown and down-tempo. Maybe ultimately coming from Meshuggah, right? A bunch of things we think people in extreme metal should be talking about, but they generally aren't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like Meshuggah is one of those cases of an outstanding band with terrible consequences in a lot of cases.
And bad vocals.
Oh, I like the vocals, but, yeah, to each their own. But, I guess for us, it's like, we like beat down, we like down tempo. I think we both agree that, for the most part, gent is a complete loss.
Gent is, yes, the gent is a terrible genre that served only as R&D.
Yeah, so you can take elements from it, some of the rhythmic ideas and some of the kind of tonal ideas, and you can apply them to much more interesting music.
Yeah, I think the band that really proved that is Sectioned. The sort of the sort of industrial crust grind band from the UK that has this sort of like bent sub-bass heavy gent type stuff going on in it. And it just is manifestly really cool and heavy, right? They found something to do with that technique. We heard some of it also. I mean, another band drawing from this well is Serpent Column. Not so much the gent, but definitely the Meshuggah, and definitely sort of like, stuff like Dillinger Escape Plan, stuff like Sectioned, all very relevant to that, being incorporated into black metal. So a sort of heretical movement that's being explored more and more. Of course, the other piece of the puzzle here is, a band like Serpent Column was also very interested in like DSO and ulcerate type stuff. And those also appear to be reference points for Norse, but there really isn't much here that sounds like DSO chording or melody, is there?
No, I think the DSO and the ulcerate bears out, but it's more in how these songs are structured rather than specific rhythmic or melodic phrasing. Honestly, the thing... Oh, go ahead.
More in the general idea of a hyper modern kind of black metal or something,
that and, in the very kind of linear wandering song structures that tend not to concentrate too heavily on any one motif. They're more exploratory. But the thing we've covered on the show that this immediately reminds me of the most is Humanity's Last Breath. Who we covered a few months ago, who are a very unusual, widely influenced sort of a band that's really like a down-tempo band at its core, but it's laced with all these electronic and industrial and black metal ideas throughout, so it's never monotonous. There's always interesting ideas going on. And something very similar happens with this Norse record, I think.
Yeah, like Humanity's Last Breath is coming from down-tempo, going toward black metal in a way. This is coming from black metal, going toward down-tempo. Both of them are converging on this idea of a new kind of industrial extreme metal.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to talk to some of the guys playing stuff like this and seeing like whether they read it in that way, whether it scans to them as... whether the industrial thing is more of an accident or if it's a prime motivator for this kind of music, I guess.
Yeah, well, definitely the kind of, the emphasis on texture and repetition and, sort of singular sound object type things and these kind of cut up song structures are for sure very industrial in a structural sense, right? That is maybe deeper than just throwing a black metal beat or throwing an industrial beat under your black metal stuff. But yeah, it's whatever the intent, this is pretty interesting stuff. Let's check out the beginning of the record. So that was really riffy. Did you hear any black metal riffs?
Well, what the fuck is a black metal riff these days? Apparently, nowadays it seems to entail just about fucking everything. I would say the stuff towards the end, like that, where they start feathering in that little arpeggiated figure, that dun 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 dun. Because something I forgot to mention up front is I think one of the biggest influences for this is going to be Bloodosc Nord. So from that mid-era, like work which transforms God era, you'll hear those kinds of figures on those records from around that time period. But obviously Bloodosc Nord has always been on the fringe of black metal, so I guess it's kind of a ear of the beholder thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, and these are those last riffs were really cool, but you get this sort of like rolling chug riff with these sort of rapid slide arpeggios, sort of like, is that like a sweep kind of the
yeah, it's like as opposed to like a full up and down sweep, it's like a straight like descending sweep, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Those are kind of formatted like thrash riffs, but played with this kind of, in cubist abstraction, right? And they're sort of like very industrial sounding. And the riff at the beginning is just hilarious in a great way, because it just, that's just a taboo shatterer, right? That's like... in terms of the sort of stigma against, we've always railed on this show against, no mosh, no core, no whatever. Pointing out that, like, Mayhem and Emperor in their prime both had mosh parts.
Yeah.
And were extremely fun, at least if you like having actual fun. So, like, moshy stuff and physical stuff has always come in and out of black metal in various places. But chugs have certainly been, outside of black thrash, have certainly been stigmatized. And the idea of starting your record by just slamming the low open string, dung, 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 dun, 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 dum, dum. Can you imagine how angry, like, Metal Archives would have been about that, like, 15 years ago?
Yeah, but it's like, at the same time, it's like, it's not even that unprecedented, if you really think about it. Obviously, the production and the tone and the timbre of this music is really alien to black metal, but, Bathory had a lot of, like, really simple, just bashing figures like that. Maybe it wasn't necessarily an open string, but yeah, they would just sit on a single power chord for an oddly long time,
Oh, no.
It was... Yeah.
I agree. Obviously, like, we think this is cool. And yes, it is consistent with many things in black metal. The idea that black metal should be sort of droning and should involve primal physicality is very important to me, right? So this fits right in. But the specific syncopation, we all know, is the whole band jumping up and down deathcore riff.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that's interesting to me, is because this record scans to me, and it's really kind of a Rorschach test thing, but this really scans to me more as a kind of abstract down-tempo record than it does as a black metal record. But you can really, depending on the frame of reference you're using, what sort of literary interpretation, from a Marxist lens, this looks like a down-tempo record,
From a Well, now I'm trying to figure out what the Marxist reading of this would be. It's I'll come back to me. I'm working on it.
Okay. Well, while you're working on that, let me play a sample. So this is going to be off the third track, Fearless Filth Seeker. This is from the middle of the song. And here you're going to... I think this is a pretty good representative sample of the kind of stuff you're going to hear regularly throughout the record. So it's going to open with a very Blood Aus Nord kind of dissonant phrase, and the dissonance thing, we'll get back to that, because that's one of our little bugbears we constantly like to harp on. And then it drifts into a very kind of electronic, brushed down-tempo part, similar to a band that I really like called Memoria Brooded. And then there's a really cool ending moment of just a really simple arpeggiated guitar figure with this kind of gliding, like, continuous bass melody underneath it. And I think this just shows off some of the best stuff this band is capable of. A lot of stuff going on in that passage, but that final passage, just that wonderful gliding bass melody underneath everything, and the really cool staggering of the 4/4 versus 6/8 on the guitars versus the drums respectively, creates this really cool rhythmic interplay. It's like a very simplified version of the kind of stuff that Meshuggah does. Arranging these odd time sections over and over again so they eventually sync up to 4/4.
So what do you mean about the 4/4 versus the 6/8? Do you mean like the way the guitar's doing sort of like a...
Yeah, if you...
Is that like the 4/4?
Yeah, the guitar is doing... it sounds... It's kind of like a trick of the ear thing, so it sounds like the guitar is doing like a kind of a triplet pattern, but it's actually just doing kind of 4/4 eighth note arrangements.
No, I can hear that. Yeah.
And then I'm not sure if the drums are in a true 6/8 or if they're just in like a really dramatic kind of swing time against the 4/4. But you get the effect of like these shifting rhythmic textures kind of flowing against each other and then syncing up at the end of passages.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's like a pretty simple polyrhythmic technique. Well, I say simple, it's very difficult to do, especially if you're playing it live. But like mathematically, it's relatively simple for this kind of thing.
Speak for yourself. I listen to black metal.
I was a tech death kid, all right? I can't use any of it because I can't play guitar that well, but...
I can't count higher. The only numbers I can count are 4, 8, and 16.
Those are the only ones you need, buddy.
Yeah.
But I guess, how would you read that last figure? Because, spoiler, we were attempting to record the show last night and ran into numerous technical issues, so we had to push it a day.
Yes,
and we were talking...
Thor, Odin, the saints, and the angels all decided to smite our episode.
Yeah, maybe like if we had gotten done, I would have walked outside and gotten killed by an alligator or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But we were talking a little bit last night about how that scans, and we were talking, kind of in the abstract about this idea of kind of goth coming back into extreme metal. I associated this a little bit with like Killing Joke in a way. And I think you associate with some goth rock stuff, all of which, maybe it's just on our brains lately because we're finding a lot of it, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think whenever I hear that kind of, certain kind of ringing arpeggio stuff over guitar doing textural work over free-moving bass, I think that is basically the goth technique. Where you transfer the core riff idea to the bass, and playing with rhythm in a way that's very unfamiliar in black and more straight-ahead death metal. Certainly more open kinds of rhythm than you'd find in almost any death metal normally. In goth, like more just groove. I think that's a very gothy thing for sure. Killing Joke in the tone, I was thinking about that, like, Killing Joke always sounded more skronky and weird than that. Those are actually very pretty sort of, like minor scale chord changes, right?
Yeah, this is probably just like Cure stuff that I haven't heard or something.
Well, it's just filtered through. It is a goth technique, but it's filtered through the era of metal. It's filtered through there being 30 years of screamo type stuff influenced by this. But Killing Joke would be one. Cure maybe. The band that I can't. It's just been on the brain so much. I might as well bring it into the episode. I've been going back and listening to all the old Ackercocker records, and who's one of those bands that I think is not mentioned nearly enough, and anticipated a lot of the stuff that got credited to DSO.
I can see that,
DSO was clearly listening to Killing Joke. Ackercock were clearly, like, they're just straight... The atmospheric guitar textures they do that would later get attributed to DSO in black metal and Ackercock are literally clearly coming from two bands, Killing Joke and Sonic Youth. Since they've reunited, there are one of their biggest promo pictures just has him wearing a Sonic Youth shirt right up front. Sonic Youth first of all, were part of the trend of long trend of Americans taking European music, or British and European music, and making it less weird. But Sonic Youth were hugely influenced by Killing Joke, and made some more kind of pretty delicate sounding stuff with it in places. So the particular melodies you hear here, you'd be more likely to get in Sonic Youth, I'd say. Either way, Ackercocker was really into those and like Fields of the Nephilim and shit. And they take, they take the Killing Joke stuff or the Sonic Youth stuff and they pull it closer to the sort of like noble Dorian scale melodies you get in metal that are already in Fields of the Nephilim. And this record is this band seems to be drawing on that sort of complex of like metal-fied goth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see that. And kind of as an adjunct to that, before it escapes me, brief diversion to say, all the reviews of this, people on Bandcamp, etc., are talking about this being really dissonant. This is
this is the moment.
A very dissonant record. Like, there are dissonant moments, but for the most part, there's a lot of consonant melodies on this. I think, at this point, I think we've probably talked about this on the show, I think most people literally don't know what that word means. And just, like, apply it to stuff with, like, certain textures or certain timbres. I mean, the whole idea of dissonance itself is a very subjective kind of term of art, more than it refers to things formally. But I think what a lot of people are getting caught up on here is that I'm almost certain this band is using an 8-string guitar. And I think that if you, because an 8-string guitar basically gives you another octave to play around with in terms of the range on the whole instrument. So I think that a lot of people just aren't used to hearing some of these ideas harmonized as dramatically as they are. I think if you
So are they letting higher strings ring, or is it more like the melodies are leaping in ways that they wouldn't be able to do on a normal guitar?
I think that they're leaping more. I think that I mean you've got different harmonization opportunities, some that are much higher or much lower than people are used to hearing in this style of music. The 8-string itself has a very unique kind of timbre to it, you know, halfway between a bass and a regular guitar in a way. So I think that if you compressed some of these riffs, some of these melodies down into a single octave, like you might hear them on a 6-string guitar, they would immediately be much more readable to the average listener. But that's just like a pet peeve of mine as an 8-string player.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, I think they're also, I mean, you know, they're listening to guitar tone. Like, the fact that this has a tone that does not sound like, the fact that this is a highly digital processed tone that's being manipulated intentionally, right? The point is that this isn't sterile, lame digital production. This is like a cool,
very
medium...
carefully sculpted.
Yeah, cool, medium-specific use of what you can do with computers, right? This has a harsh digital tone, right? Or... if it's not, maybe the band would say, oh, this isn't line in. Okay, maybe they're using like a solid state amp or something. I don't know anything about gear. But like, it's, is solid state the word for it?
Solid state just refers to
Yeah.
Amps that don't use vacuum tubes. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
get what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So they have it has this deliberately more mechanical or industrial tone to the guitars, and people hear that and they hear the reverb and the clanging and they think dissonant. To the degree that there's, and it's just because they're hearing tonal similarities to DSO and ulcerate, both of whom really do play dissonant things, as in massive clusters of like tritones and half steps and things that don't fit together in normal scales at the same time. Right?
Yeah.
This is the kind of dissonance that's here is much more traditional to black metal and heavy metal in general, which is just like, I mean, Black Sabbath, dum, dum, you know,
Yeah.
or the other one, dum, dum. There are your two most important dissonant intervals in metal, which are also the two most important intervals in metal.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, so it's definitely not especially dissonant, but it is industrial, and it is weird sounding. Let's go to a place with some. This is another place. Yeah, let's go to some more. Here's some cool skronky stuff, but not particularly dissonant, but skronky. This is from Accelerated Subversion toward the end, and then you'll also hear a moment where it gets markedly less skronky. And if you listen for the place where it sounds like shift from more dissonant stuff to more sort of consonant, regular sort of minor scale type stuff, you'll hear it at the end. So the main riff they're doing there is like wom dom 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 da dum. That's just 1/4 like minor third. But what they do that makes it sound dissonant is that they just do one of those skronky cluster chords on the third. Mm-hmm. Right? Does that sound right?
Yeah, it's just kind of like a maybe like a converge thing. It's just like a nasty kind of like high bar chord, or just like a weird little cluster figure on the bottom of the guitar.
Yeah. And so they do use those in places, but that's fairly standard issue at this point. You know, similarly, there was another place where they were doing that cluster earlier on the more palmuty riff, and I think they were just clustering on the tritone. So just like doing a metal dissonant thing and using a cluster chord.
Yeah, and typically when they do those kind of nasty clustered things, the root note is usually always contiguous with the melody. It's just kind of like added flesh on top.
Exactly. So that's where I was going, is that they do this, the blast part is awesome, right? I love the sort of the way because they're taking this more industrial framework to it, they're not wedded to ideas of what a metal riff has to be. So they do this like, they've got the blast going, and then they do this sort of cycling, pulsed, single note riff, just that works with a bend. Just wom, 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 under it, right? They introduced that. And when that cuts out, and when that's playing, right, it sounds like a super dissonant riff over that. When that cuts out, stops, slows down, and then the big bass riff enters, right? The top melody doesn't change at all, and yet it meshes perfectly with the bass riff, which is just classic, epic, minor scale metal riff. You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's these guys have a talent for kind of rejiggering traditional kind of metal melodic phrases into these weird contexts just by playing with rhythm and playing with tempo and timbre. Like, there's a way to play all the music on this record that sounds a lot more mainline extreme metal. You know, it's all the detail work, the production work, and kind of I almost wonder if, like, when they started writing this record, it sounded a lot more straightforward, and then they kind of went in with a fine-tooth comb and were like, what can we stretch out? You know, kind of going section by section, what can we do to make this a little more unique, a little bit weirder, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, their last record was, if anything, like, I like this better. I think this is a step up from Divine Light of a New Sun. Gene Wolfe reference, potentially. Which was, which, like, sounded maybe, on the one hand, I think it was more blasty and conventionally metallic, but it sounded almost too much like the sort of more core-ish influences, to the point where it was just like sort of, you know, harsh vocals and, you know, high speed and very skillful. There were really cool, unusual hooks in it, like sort of like off-time rolling double bass things, but they worked melodically, like, and in terms of the guitar tone, a lot like just kind of like gent songs. Like, it was too much like well-done mainstream metal. This is both, I mean, we can debate whether it's black metal, but it's definitely closer to the black metal spirit. And it's also closer. It's also closer to the most interesting sides of that sort of avant-core stuff, which is the truly inhuman-sounding stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I see where you're coming from. I mean, I'm not familiar with the last one, but I think that these guys are walking this really delicate tightrope when it comes to their influences, you know, because, like, if you go too far in either direction, the influence from one or the other can seem very gestural, you know. Like, right now there's kind of a fashionable thing going on in the deathcore scene, which is to do blackened deathcore, they call it.
That's been going on for 10 years.
Yeah, but it's really picked up speed in the past few.
It's worse now. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, it's worse now. It's like a lot of the kids that I talk to at local shows are talking about, oh, like, have you heard the new Lorna Shore? It's like, oh, there's a ton of black metal in it. Of course, none of it sounds like black metal. It's...
The names are exactly the same.
The names are exactly the same.
It's like they've forgotten the cautionary tale of Abigail Williams.
I like that first EP, though. But anyway. No. Well, that was just, people figuring out, black metal can have, sick, cool breakdowns. And then we got Winterfilleth, and then it was all uphill from there. But, no, it's... And what they're talking about is it's mostly, Zoomers rediscovering, old school, Melodeath meets metalcore shit that was so popular when we were growing up, but they weren't around for it. But now with kind of this, blackened veneer over it. But what I'm saying
that sounds really terrible.
It's not unlistenable, it's just very boring, for the most part. We've just heard it all before. But what I'm getting at with that comparison is that, when you're taking these elements that are basically... I mean, we can think of these, spiritual commonalities, and we can, engage in this sort of, metal critic sophistry, but they're basically from opposite ends of a spectrum. And when you're putting them together, you have this very delicate line to walk about maybe not letting one be too prominent over the other, not using either one in a monodimensional way. And it makes it tricky to execute, but I think these guys really stick the landing, and I'm impressed by that. But jumping off that, so I really like this record, but I do have questions about this style in general. So I'll go to my last sample off of Zero Insight. That's towards the back end of the record. And I'll talk about, I like this record a lot, and we've been hearing more and more stuff like this, but where does it go from here? So I'm almost positive I've talked about this idea before on another record we've covered this year, but a lot of this record concentrates on the parts where the quote-unquote nothing happens, so to speak. This is a record really focused on connective tissue. A lot of these kind of like softer, more wandering passages between the bigger, more riff-oriented stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's a technique we're starting to hear more and more of, and I think these guys execute it particularly well because they're emphasizing the sort of sound object nature of these individual passages, which is one of the things that brings to mind, industrial and neofolk and that sort of thing as a major influence here. My question is not so much about this record, but maybe the next one, and really the future of this style in general, is we've been hearing more and more stuff like this, and a lot of stuff in the sort of like orthodox meets caverncore niche that's getting really popular now. And both of these ideas have a lot to do with each other in the way that they're kind of assembling songs. And I guess my question is, we've heard a lot of good records in those styles this year, but I can say there's a vocabulary getting established and getting set in stone a little bit quickly. And there's definitely certain
that's a way to
things,
put it, yeah.
Yeah, there's certain things that are happening, like certain little ideas and structural conceits and stuff that are popping up on these records that I'm not as excited about now as I was even 6 months ago. Like, on the first sample I played, they did something that's become very common to both of these styles, which is the sort of slow looping, droning arpeggio with slow drums that slip into a blast beat without any sort of fill or any sort of announcement. And it's like, I think I've heard that on every one of those records we've heard this year, and it's like,
This is like what happened to original Orthodox black metal, where the first time someone did a halftime drop to a spooky 6/8 arpeggio, it probably sounded like the first time Watain did that. It probably sounded really sinister, and then like
it became a parody of itself.
Oh, here it comes, spooky arpeggio time.
Yeah, so I guess that's the question that I just want to bring up is, like, I think these guys have found a way around it because they're concentrating on this very sort of industrial structuring, but for a lot of these bands, I think even next year, which is really only a few months away, I'm going to be a lot more critical about stuff like that. It's like, okay, 2021...
Yeah, so
2021, get all of your fat glides into blast beats and your, like, arcing bass tones over black metal arpeggio stuff out of the way, because we're going to have to find new shit for 2022.
Yeah, I hear what you mean. I mean, another way to put it would be, like, it sounds like they're relying... A lot of bands relying a lot on these kind of ambient droning passages to stitch together riff ideas, right?
Yes. Yes.
And this band can get away with it more than some of the others we've talked about because, all of them have shown some skill with the ambient stuff that metal bands did not have with that sort of thing 5 or 10 years ago, right? So that's one reason we have more time for it this year. This band in particular, right, because it's part of a more general structuring principle, kind of like the Murmuüre, the true Murmuüre we talked about at the beginning of the show. Like, they're structuring their music like industrial. They can get away with it more. However, these passages don't, like, am I going to remember the well-executed ambient passages on this record? Probably not, right?
So, what do you think the answer is? Developing a more concrete kind of melodic vocabulary or riffing style?
I think there's like... Yeah, I mean, I think it's... I think we... more concrete... Well, this band's moved away from riffing, per se, right? Probably find a way to riff, but using the techniques of the ambient stuff.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
And we are back from the clanging but not dissonant sounds of Norse with the fiercely consonant sounds of Solitvdo on Hegemonikon, out on ATMF, the Italian label whose acronym I can't remember, but it has something to do with eternity and shadows.
For the record, it's Aeternitas Tenebrarum Musicae Fundamentum.
Fundamental Music of Eternal Shadow, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty metal. I mean,
yeah, no, indeed, and it's it's a solid label. And this is so Solitvdo is in some way like a just core band for this label. I believe this label also did Nova, and this is a Italian band continuing the black metal sound founded by Spite Extremewing and some lesser-known bands who were part of their black circle called the Invita Armada, that is, Invincible Armada. Janus. We've covered at least one other band in this school on this show, right? We did Laetitia and Holocaust. Was there anything else in that vein we've done?
I don't think a lot of stuff that brings it to mind, but not stuff specifically from that scene.
Yes, and we found that Spite was one of those bands that was over a decade ahead of its time, and yet none of the things that you would think are influenced by it are.
It's the most frustrating part of this show.
Yes,
and just like a peek behind the scenes, we'll always, we pretty much always send our reviews to the bands, just so they can check it out. And every goddamn time we send something in that sounds like it's very influenced by Spite, they will always respond back with, "Hey, really like the review, really like the detail. Wasn't really familiar with Spite, but listening to them now, yeah, they're pretty cool." It's like every single time. Yep. It's ridiculous. Yep. It's the one thing we're always wrong about.
Yes. So Solitvdo, however, understands what an important band that was, and has sort of been on a quest to extend that sound, or develop it, for quite a while. This is a one-man project. The first one was Immerso in un bosco di querce. That means something like, immersed in a grove of oak, in 2014. I had not heard that one. I just went back and checked it out. It is atmospheric black metal. So the path this guy has gone down is one that is now common, which is be young, record an album of atmospheric black metal, decide that atmospheric black metal sucks, and move forward. And since then, he's done... I haven't listened to that one enough to know whether it's a decent take on that style or not. It's probably better than average, but he's explored other pastures since then. So I followed this band since Hierarchus, and basically what happened was after that is with Hierarchus and Militia, he did 2 very short full-lengths, each of which you could hear him trying out a way to channel or develop the basic sort of the basic mood of Spite Extremewing, which we've described as sort of like solar, virile, modernistic, clearly defined structures, into different modes, right? Spite Extremewing is very guitar-oriented, riff-driven music, right? So, and very power chord, sort of grinding power chord attack black metal at its core, at least for most of it. But Hierarchus was like, had that kind of vibe. It was very focused on just ancient Rome. But it was recorded in almost this like summoning or dungeon synthy way, with blast beats and sort of blast beats and densely layered orchestral keys. So it basically sounded like martial industrial in motion. Like I think you thought of a band that I also thought of.
Triarii.
Yeah, it's basically like a Triarii record with a little less. Triarii is a little bit deliberately campy. This was a little more serious, but very similar vibe. Arditi also, although Arditi is a lot more abstract. That kind of mood. And, it could verge a little too far on the Age of Empires soundtrack part. Not that that's a great soundtrack, don't get me wrong. But it was pretty cool. It just explored this one simple mood, sort of stern, resolute Roman music. And it did that very well for its short duration. Militia gets closer to the Spite Extremewing type thing, as in it's very guitar-driven, very active and riffy. his sort of, manly bellowing vocals, and very clear-cut melodies. But the voicing is really different. So the guitar technique, instead of being based on these sort of like elemental chord shapes, becomes all leads and played on the low end of the guitar in this really death metal way. Really cool idea. They're playing these sort of like flowery, flamboyant. We've talked about sort of like flamboyant masculinity in a lot of the Southern European bands. How do you be, how do you be sort of over the top and colorful, but also manly? And so this is a very good version of that. But something for me about that, those songs are really cool at first, but they, for me at least, they seemed there was something a little missing to them. Like they were, I say this on the show about things, but they were a little too smooth, not quite enough bite. And this record seems, now that we've heard this one, Hegemonikon, it's easy to understand what was going on there, which was those were R&D focusing on single ideas that have now been incorporated into this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is your first time with this band. What do you make of it?
Oh, this is an instant best of the year for me. Like, this is absolutely on my end of the year list. I am horrified by the idea that you've been listening to this guy for 5 years and you've just never felt like showing it to me. It feels like a personal betrayal, honestly.
It was on my list of things I needed to get around to.
Yeah, no, this is phenomenal. Like you were saying, this is an extension of the kind of melodic principles of Spite Extreme Wing, but executed in a radically different way, which we'll be able to tell pretty immediately when we get to the samples. Spite Extreme Wing is concentrated on huge flourishes. It's concentrated on maximalist, space-filling guitar tone and really intensely exciting, dynamic, high-speed riffing. Where Solitvdo, at least on this record,
it's very hardcore driven.
It's very hardcore and punk driven. Solitvdo, on the other hand, is much more stately. Structurally, Spite Extreme Wing songs always kind of resemble punk songs structurally in a way. Solitvdo, they resemble like neofolk or, like you said, martial industrial songs. Each track, this is a short record, it's under half an hour, but each of the 4 main tracks on this is this single, like, immutable block of a single idea progressing forward. And it is...
Spite Extreme Wing is just always furiously in motion, right? I mean, on the records I like better, it sounds more like a series of lightning bolts being thrown. On the record you like better, Ultra, it's more like this seamlessly flowing kind of lute-played folk melody or whatever, right? Like somebody playing Motorhead on a lute. And
which is the ultimate, the apex of heavy metal, right? That's what we're trying to get to on this show.
Exactly, really. It's pretty much, yeah. But on this record, it sounds like architecture. There was a lot of vertical leaping in Spite Extreme Wing, but again, in a very different way. Here, this is the vertical quality of like watching a Doric temple move toward you, which would be a very intimidating prospect.
It's also just like, it's also like similar to something like Ultra. I mean, look at the art. It's this very like early 20th century modernist. I mean, it's a more modern take on that sort of aesthetic. And it's like
it's Italian
really,
futurism. Yeah,
this is totally Italian futurism, which is an aesthetic that I really enjoy a whole lot. And a lot of the bands in Invita Armada explored that kind of idea. Spite got really into it in their later records. And this is continuing it, but in a very different way. And I think that one thing you touched on that I think is a significant influence, because I thought of it too, was summoning. Obviously, the way these songs are executed, moment to moment.
You're the summoning expert here, so you'll have to explain. I was just like, summoning.
To a degree. I don't listen to Summoning a ton, but I've listened to all the records at least once at this point. Summoning, moment to moment, this sounds extremely different from Summoning, but the structural conceit of a single idea progressing inexorably toward its own conclusion is a very Summoning idea. Like, Summoning do cool albums, but their albums really are just collections of individual songs. The narrative is within the single song. And here, it kind of branches across all of these tracks.
Yeah.
But ultimately, all of these songs are different refrains on the same core idea. Like, just pounded into the listener, but never getting boring. This is just... I could talk about this forever, but I want to play a sample just because I want to fucking listen to this more. So, Hegemonikon 1. We're just going to go with that. That is the first kind of real track on the record after the intro. And here's where we'll see the first big distinction from Spite Extremewing, which is, instead of being a guitar-based band, this is fundamentally, at its core, a synth and kind of a, really a trumpet-based band, as well.
Yes.
So, yeah, like I was saying up front, and I'm sure you agree, while there are outstanding riffs across this record, which definitely at points equal Spite Extremewing, the fundamental...
The initial, just while I remember, and while people remember it before we redirect, the initial riff on this sample, dun, 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 you know, that's like a simplified Spite Extremewing riff.
Oh yeah, no, clearly they're specifically designed to sound like those riffs. He's been studying it. But clearly the fundamental melodic core of these songs, in a very traditional kind of classical sense, is the trumpets, which are across all of these tracks and are the fundamental texture of this music. And they're fucking outstanding.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is... I was going to talk about this with my sample, but I think we should talk about it now. I think something's happening this year, man. There's been some sort of technological change that suddenly makes old, like, makes a thing that was like the depth of corniness, which is digitally synthesized orchestra effects, suddenly viable in a way that I think nobody saw coming.
And especially brass instruments.
Yes. Like, it... Yeah, so, like, this year has been the year... Yeah, I mean, of course, there's the... I mean, obviously, I fucking love Emperor, and I love the idea of, there's a rawness to the Casio, the digital Casio string synth. That's awesome, and you can do cool things with that, especially if you're keeping it in that sort of punky format where it's fighting against, like chainsaw guitars, right? But, thereafter, right, digital synths sort of hit the bong and depart for the great fluffy palace of the skies. Right, where and usually just sound like shit. But there's something going on where suddenly the patches are way better, and they're just being used in smarter ways. And yeah, the horns. So the other record we've heard this year that does this is Hour of Ragnarok by Graveland.
Yeah, that also had excellent synth melodies.
And it focused on the horns in a way that, and oboe synths in a way that was, unprecedented. He used synths in a pretty chill way before, but it was the old school Emperor way.
Yeah.
And so, the riffs on Hour of Ragnarok are all transferred to, synthesized horns. And the same thing is happening here. There are other synths, right? There are a lot of strings. There were some horns, and there were a lot of strings in general on Hierarchus. Here, there are still densely layered string synths, and then just the horns soaring over it.
And, there's something... What I love so much about the sort of trumpet melodies on this record, it's that they're so kind of stark and minimal in a sense. They're not even really harmonized a lot of the time. They're these single unwavering tones, just taking up so much space in the production. It's such a daring move to make, to put so much on these very simple ideas. It requires so much faith in your own ability to write them. And it lands every single time. Every single time it happens, it's the best time.
Well, that's one way it types into the idea of, clear geometric form in cubism, or in this kind of, or in, futurism, or this kind of, the clean line, the sort of the violent angle, the crisply defined contour or movement, right? And the way that taps into the legacy of ancient classical architecture or whatever. It's unlike a lot of modern black metal, it is not relying on texture blurring effects, which are so often used to hide an absence of ideas, right?
Yeah.
There's tons of layering and texture here. Simple basic idea, which is noble Dorian scale harmony, but all sorts of layering happening within that to make that sort of tense and powerful. And then over that, just these, crisp horn melodies. Yeah, and it's I will hang everything on this. And yeah, it works. I agree.
Yeah, it's kind of unbelievable. This is one of those records I hear where it's every time I think we can't expand on these ideas any further, you find a guy who just has this fucking unwavering vision for how this stuff should sound, and it's just a lot of my review here is just going to be me gushing about how fucking cool this is.
Yeah, well, let's move on then to we'll continue the gush. We'll continue the clearly directed masculine flow to Vita Est Proelium 1. And so this is a good example of how you take the sort of whatever you want to call them, epic, triumphant, whatever, we on the show call them noble melodies that are popular now. At their best, they're noble. And make them sound just grim and scowling and stern in the way that the oldest black metal is. So here we go.
quick before you go into that sample, listening very closely, either this is literally one of the best synth patches I've ever heard, or there's a substantial chance this is a real trumpet being played.
I mean, let me consult the promo.
I was just checking that myself. It didn't say, but there was
if he used a real trumpet and they don't mention that in the promo, that is, as they say, baller. Because that's usually exactly the kind of thing that gets plied for novelty.
Well, because there's like in that elongated solo trumpet passage, there's these like wavering tones between notes that sound exactly like it's being played on a real instrument.
Yeah.
So either synthesized instruments
vibrato.
Either they've become so sophisticated that they're basically indistinguishable from the real thing, or he's just playing a goddamn trumpet,
or getting someone else to.
Yeah, possibly.
Either way, so two things, right? So first, the keyboard patch there at the end, the choirs also. I don't think those were on Hierarchus. The sort of sort of a lot of the sinister bite at the beginning of that sample is coming from the choirs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is very Emperor. This and the Graveland record and a number of other things. Early Emperor is getting its revenge, despite the best/worst efforts of Thin Sunglasses Emperor to tarnish their reputation. The cool pre-Nightside songs are finally getting their due in some ways. And but with that also, a band that you like a lot, like, were Seer Bliss ahead of their time?
I mean, Seer Bliss were absolutely ahead of their time, but I don't know how many people...
Well, Wilkins agrees.
Yeah, Wilkins always agrees with everything I say.
Mm-hmm.
He's the third mic on the podcast. Mm-hmm. He has to jump on top of the fridge and bite a loaf of bread real quick. It's like I keep telling him, you can't even digest that. What are you doing? But anyway, but yeah, no, I get it. It's definitely, and it's interesting because kind of the passages that you chose versus the ones that I chose both reflect like our different favorite parts of Spite Extremewing. You chose a lot of things with that a little bit of darker bite, like non-Ducor Duco kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I chose a lot of stuff that's straight ultra, just like blasting, fiery, huge blocks of single glorious chords and stuff. So it's pretty cool.
Dum, 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 dum. Right? So there's a very easy way to write those intervals in a way that makes them not sound as stern as they sound here. But he does it. Another thing to point out here is, which I mentioned at the beginning, but is the rumbling bass.
Yeah.
If the basic two elements of this band are the big stacked keyboard melodies over blast beats on the one hand from Hierarchus, and then sort of like riffy, dynamic, kind of lead type guitar riffing from Militia, he's done something really ballsy, which is, instead of the expected thing, which is, oh yeah, more of the big guitar riffy stuff, he's made that purely accessory to the keys, and he's transferred some of the melodic work to the bass. And the bass has that bulldozer sound that we're starting to hear more in like non-first wave black metal, right? The bass has that, we got it in Eisensker, we got it in Hate Spirit on the last episode. There have been a couple other bands we've reviewed where like there's straight ahead pagan black metal or whatever with like Discharge or Venom bass. And he's doing that here, and the bass is doing riffy, not like super free stuff, but at the end, when you get those big chord motions, the bass is riffing in around the main riff. And it adds a lot of the bite and tension that, was sort of less present on Militia here.
Yeah. No, this is a record that will reveal more and more with multiple listens. Because at first glance, much of this sounds the same, and it's supposed to. But then, the more you dive in, and the more you start being able to peel away the layers of the synths versus the riffs underneath, and then the contrasting bass melodies as well, you'll start to find more and more, to seize onto. So what appears to be very simple, straightforward music at first is actually extremely complex. So let's go to Vita Est Prolium 2. And I should say these are very difficult songs to sample because they're linear sequences of ideas. You really have to take them as a whole. But here is a passage where you can hear the Spite Extreme Wing a little bit more distinctly in the riffing. But ultimately, as always, that is subservient to the ultimate like meta idea at the heart of this record. This eternal recurrence, we might say, of like glory and triumph just going forever, into the future. Yeah, this is a cool part. So yeah, it's the ebb and flow of these songs is it's very, very neoclassical in a way. These I mean, in a sense, it's very heavy metal in that it's this very discrete series of peaks and valleys, but the way it organically slips between these adjustments on this core melodic motif is very, very classical to me. It's so sophisticated. It's one of those records that's just so like light years beyond its contemporaries in terms of structuring.
You get to the place around, what is it, 219 or something, where you think that it's normally the song there, the epic climactic part finishes and you drop back into a verse riff. Like maybe you'd go back into the flourishes of guitar. Instead, it takes off, right? This is, Now, that's an effect that's sometimes used in pop songs, right? The classic one of Living on a Prayer. It's like, oh, this chorus is sick. Whoa, that's the chorus! Right? But but this is occurring totally outside of a verse-chorus structure. It just, the song changes. and suddenly it's lifted by this song puts forward more both the guitar and the bass at the beginning, and then gradually the key orchestration takes over until at that point it's like the guitar and the bass recede, and suddenly the keys hang on a higher note. There's a key change, and it just takes off.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is that the guitars and the bass recede in terms of prominence, but they never stop keeping up with the energy and changing. Like, there's more wonderful bass work across that entire passage. Yeah.
No, there's just passage of melody between, just passage of lead melody between parts. That's the thing, like, there's clearly, I mean, obviously, the record's called fucking Hegemonikon. It has a bunch of lightning bolts and Apollo firing a bow, right? There's obviously ideas of, power and hierarchy in play here.
Yeah.
And you can hear that idea manifest in the music, where there are, it's extremely conscious of how vertical it is, right? Morbid Angel makes very vertical architectural music with just a guitar line, right? But here it's like, often the keys are the uppermost part in a black metal arrangement and are often less important than everything else.
Yeah.
Even in most parts of the Old Emperor. Here the idea is keys are the upper stratum, there are guitars, and there is bass. And within the keys, there is an arrangement too, right? There's like trumpets, right, horns over the strings. And yet, this isn't some sort of thing where everything is at the service of the keys. The keys aren't just sort of like dominating the arrangement. It's not like the other parts aren't fleshed out. A keyword from the promo that I thought was good was tension, right? Like inner and external tension and conflict. And these are sort of tensile forces. Every part has its own capacity. And they sort of push and they strive against each other. Sometimes they come to the foreground, sometimes they recede. The really daring thing about this is, if anything, the guitars are less important than the bass and the keys.
Yeah, in a lot of parts, I'd agree.
But it's so cool because he's got a great command of the guitar and he can write great riffs. And in this song, more than anything, the guitar gets its place. It comes out in the middle. And those are the sort of cascading, folky riffs you got on sort of lute type riffs from Militia. You get this sort of these various independent powers held in tension and sort of trading off.
Yeah.
It's here's Hegemonikon 2. I think we've at this point had all the big ideas. But we'll just lead with this. Here's one way to start a song. Oh, sorry, I let that roll way too far past the end of the sample.
Oh, it's okay. I did too.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's an incredible album. It's just Jesus Christ. Like it's there's been a few times this year where I've just been so taken aback by a record. It's like, oh, this guy just he gets it in a way that very few other people do, and just the complete mastery and the confidence with which he executes it is borderline unparalleled.
Well, it's the nerdy thing I want to say here is like, this is a specific way of doing a slow black metal song that doesn't lose momentum or become sort of atmospheric or ambient. Mm-hmm. It gets this kind of it keeps its forward motion in part through these big looping up and down cycles. So you get the guitar clanging on the octave and the bass sweeping up or after it. A lot is transferred to the bass here, which sort of like carries things forward under the chords. It's kind of, it moves more like Neurosis than a black metal song in a lot of ways. But I think there's a specific Spite Extremewing song that I think is a pattern for this, which is Disgrazione.
Yeah, I know that's one of our favorites.
Yeah, big. It's a big slow one at the end of Non Duco or Duco before they just start doing all this ambient shit, which is also awesome. But it depends on these like long drawn out melodies, bends. It's very expressive, slow playing, it's good to know that the whole there's stylistic range here, right? The record is not all it's not all based on the fast stuff, and the slow songs aren't tossed off.
It took a few years, but we finally got our Italian One Road to Asa Bay. right, ladies and gentlemen, but as always, mostly just gentlemen, we are back with my side of the show, and all those, like, epic and, like, experimental and exciting black metal feelings are gone, because here we are with 357 homicides executed on site. This is perhaps, in the over a year since we started the show, one of the most self-indulgent things I've ever brought on, because I know that most of our listener base won't be able to stand this, and I doubt I'm going to convert anyone to loving slam by reviewing this record, but god damn it, I'm going to do my best. So, 357 Homicide, as I said at the front of the show, is a two-man slam band from Manchester. These are two of the guys from, I think, kind of like a slamming beatdown band called Capital Punishment. Just, like, doing their own thing as a side project. I first got introduced to these guys earlier this year when they did a single called Civilian Incursion, and I just fell in love immediately, and I was like, well, god damn it, as soon as that record comes out, I'm going to cover it, so here we are. 357 Homicide plays a style of pretty raw, primitive slam, clearly from the cephalotripsy school. Other influences that seem pretty clear to me are going to be like artery eruption, digested flesh, vulvectomy, maybe some older, more obscure stuff like Inhuman Dissonancy. But what I find so compelling about this record is that the mood created by the music it's less concerned with just being traditionally heavy, although it is that, as much as sort of anxious and, sort of contorted sounding. There's this claustrophobic rhythmic interplay between the guitars, vocals, and drums, which I find really fascinating. The result that you get is, it's clearly slam, but the feeling is a little bit more like maybe late 90s, early 2000s brutal death from the Midwest, like United Guttural type stuff. Bands like Incestuous or Fleshgrind. But they just go about it in an extremely different way. There's all these constantly contrasting and morphing rhythmic layers that make these songs pretty exciting, and I think a lot deeper than they may appear at first blush. So, black metal guy, tell me why you hate this.
Yeah, first for our listeners, is the point that a 357 is just a very high caliber round? I was just looking this up.
It's a very big one, yeah.
Yeah, all right. A big boy. All right, so, Homicide with a very big gun. And why do I hate this? Well, I've been... you and our listeners know that the whole kind of year and a half tenure of Terminus has been like me being open-minded about brutal death metal and even some slam from time to time, right? I've been trying to figure out what you hear in it, try to see to what degree I can get into it, finding some bands, I think our best one for me is still Induced. That's something I've actually listened to independently. And then a number of other acts that I quite enjoy when I'm listening to them. And some other stuff that's, like, interesting. And some stuff, yeah, sure, I don't like it so much, but there's some good riffs, whatever, right?
Yeah.
This is the first thing in this style that you've played for me where I neither can relate to it as fun or as art. You have found my slam toleration threshold. You have pushed to and beyond the limits of my empathy. I cannot imagine what it is like to be the kind of person who likes these sounds. I actively dislike it, and I cannot see how it is good. So it's
I love your honesty there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot. This is clearly meant for connoisseurs. I get that there are people like yourself out there who get it. Allow me to say, I do not.
That's
I do
fine.
not, and I do not approve.
I did not expect you to like this in any way.
Yeah.
I felt a little bit guilty when I put it on the spreadsheet. Yeah. It's like, oh, this is just mean to the black metal guy, but
we all have those records. I have those too. Man, yeah, why don't I like it? I guess I'll get into it with the samples, but there are bands that have a lot of slams to where the slams are either something that I can... Occasionally there are kinds of slams I actively like. Often there are bands where I can understand how the slams work as punctuation marks between parts I like more. Even if, especially with the brutal death bands where the slams usually are kind of a trading off with other kinds of riffs. This is just everything I dislike about slams. 10 things I hate about slams. So, just take it away, death metal guy.
Well, I get it. So, what I'm starting to realize is, the kind of slamming elements in otherwise sort of abstract brutal death you can get into, but as far as, pure slam stuff that I brought onto the show, I mean, really the only other thing that comes to mind that's as pure as this would be the Embryectomy record from last year.
Was that Flamethrower Ecdysis?
Flamethrower Ecdysis, yes, which I know you weren't a big fan of.
I really didn't like that one, but I like it a lot better than this. That had some hardcore-ish aspects to it in places, or at least it also kind of tried to be, it was kind of funny at times. This is, it had those wubba wubba bass drop things. Yeah, I didn't like it. I also didn't like that one. You have played me Cephalotripsy, and I have some appreciation for it there. I'm like, okay, this is doing a very horrible thing with severe intensity and dedication, and I get that.
Okay, so basically, the way I read this, yes, it is a record for connoisseurs of this style. You're completely correct about this. To understand wow, this might be like my Eisensker moment, So understanding what distinguishes this from any number of other slam records just requires a ton of really just unappreciated background knowledge, but I'll try to explain it a little bit. So, I guess here's how I'll treat this review. I will treat this almost like a listening guide for how I perceive this music, the things that I want to draw attention to, and then maybe when we come out the other side, you won't like it. I know that's not going to happen, but maybe you'll get where I'm coming from a little bit.
All right, step one, get really, really high.
that usually helps for this style.
Step two, be naked.
Fully nude, covered in blood, always. So let me just go to my first sample. So we're going to go to a track called Mangled in the Snow. And here you're going to hear something a little bit different in the intro in terms of how a slam song usually starts. You're going to have this very rickety kind of claustrophobic, nervous halftime passage that opens it up, that dissolves very smoothly into the lattice work of slams. R.I.P. Syncline from Rate Your Music. I think that something that's very important to this band is the two-man setup, the very immediate interplay, and the way that all of these songs seem to be crafted through jam sessions in the practice space rather than written separately. So let's just go the first half of this track, and I'll try to clarify a little bit more.
He said that her face was gashed in all directions, and that her nose and cheeks and eyebrows and ears had been partly removed.
So, obviously, the opening is very distinctive. This sort of almost breakbeat configuration with this like noise guitar effect, and it goes on for a while, and then it goes into the riff version of that breakbeat passage, which is this very simple like 3-chord gestural cut time riff, and then the transition into the first slam is very strange. It's this very organic tempo drop that just slips in a very unusual kind of rhythmic configuration. From there, you're doing a few kind of motivic variations on that slam that are all based around the same basic melodic gesture, this sort of climbing devourment circa Butcher the Weak climbing chromatic figure. But they keep adjusting it on the fly. There's like 3 different variations that aren't changing just melodically, but rhythmically as well. But they're not distinct riffs in the way that you would normally hear from a death metal band. There's something much more gradual, much more kind of creeping and organic happening, which is something that really goes across all of these songs. The way these songs develop is a lot less blocky, a lot less mechanical than a lot of slam bands. And I think that's one of the things I'm really seizing onto here, is this sort of like practice space ebb and flow energy between the two members, which results in songs that are, in a sense, very traditional slam songs, but executed with a different kind of paranoid energy. Does any of that make sense?
Well, I guess I'm in principle in favor of music becoming more practice room and more sort of group dynamic and more based on actually playing in the same room. So I'm for that. Okay. I can hear the subtle variations. Jump, 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 jump. Okay, there's like a few different chords in there. I like the initial riff is one of the parts on the record that I get more. That sort of I mean, that's almost like a Roots, Bloody Roots kind of moment.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of a Sepultura, 90s Sepultura kind of thing. I can get into that. That's got some propulsion. And there are beatdown records that'll start out with that and then like spill into a beatdown in a cool way. There's a band called Vamachara that uses that kind of thing really well.
Vamachara. The band whose name I always try to remember that you showed me 10 years ago or something.
It wasn't 10 years ago, but it's a great band, yeah. Yeah, I mean, just the slams. The slams, my friend. They leave me cold.
Beyond that, even simpler and more straightforward, I bet a lot of it has to do with the vocals.
Well, let's talk about that. Do I appreciate that they're doing these vocals absolutely to the hilt? Yes. Do I appreciate that they're honest about it? Absolutely. So the credits are Jake Gamble, drums and vocals, gutturals, and then Matt Davies, programming, guitar, vocals, parentheses, crocs, frogs, and crickets. Right? So they're very honest about how these sound. The vocals are definitely, like, past horrifying, right? I get that the initial sort of pig squeal thing or inhale was supposed to sound like, I don't know, like squeal, piggy, squeal, kind of, deliverance kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Or like depraved, depraved, mindless serial killer kind of stuff. I understand that. This is definitely sort of mannered in a way where, like, they're just playing around with the form, right?
Yeah, these are
vocals,
established ideas now.
They're not. I get that they're not supposed to sound funny, but they're not supposed to sound heavy, right?
No, I think they're mostly to sound alien, and they're to provide different textures at different moments.
Okay, like, so here we go. So, like,
a lot of it's like timbral variation. It's like if you stuck with just the guttural stuff, that would become repetitious, because most of these styles of slam vocals, you can't get a lot of range in terms of pitch or tonality. So where in like a death or black metal band you would kind of move the pitch up or down or kind of change the tonality a little bit, here you're kind of restricted to a very binary sound, so you have to like change the technique completely to get variation.
All right, so let's talk more about it. So, severe latrogenesis, the beginning of this sample for about little over the first minute, has one of the parts I like better on this record. It's a little similar to the faster riff at the beginning of the sample you just pulled, and the vocals are also a little more. They're still there, but they're a little more sparing. Let's start from there. Yes. Continue your amusement at my expense.
It's just funny because it's like it's an example of something you don't like, but I find so much to like about it. It's just funny, the difference in perspective,
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing about so at the beginning, right? There were a couple solid riffs. Like at the beginning of that song, the sort of the more choppy thing was cool. The guttural patterns over the first slam, I could also dig. I understand there's basically like, they're very ignorant, but there's a direct line from something like Shattered Realm kind of stuff to that, right? Hip-hop influenced, slowed down, shouted vocals. You could imagine someone yelling that or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I get that. Second slam, the faster slam starts up. And, honestly, the jugga-dung, right? Direct line from For Who the Bell Tolls to that. I get that one, too. I don't love it, but you can hear it as this cool metallic sound of being slow but having too much happening in the sonic space for the allotted space, and so it sounds heavy. There's sort of compression. I get that rhythmic idea. And then the vocals start coming in, and they start coming in this sort of like clipped, exaggerated swing. And by the end of the sample, like I try, it's like, and I'm puzzled by this because it's like, it's like from exaggerating certain, like taking the syncopation in a hardcore breakdown or a slam and pushing it so far that they're like swinging it. And they're swinging it in the exaggerated way that we'd associate like with musical theater, or with like big band jazz, like at its corniest, like, or with like melodies like zippity doo da, zippity day, my oh my, what a wonderful day. It sounds breezy, and like I get that these are just, maybe that's not what they're going for at all, but that's certainly what everyone associates those melodies with. I cannot I don't get how that's supposed to be heavy unless the idea is that they're going for, again, it's some sort of irony thing, like it's supposed to be really sick, like, oh, it sounds so breezy and childish, and so it's like, I don't know, a guy in a clown mask killing someone. Is that the idea?
It's interesting because you basically nailed stuff that I would say I just come at it from a positive direction. Like, I love the exaggerated swing there, which is not something you hear that often in slam, and I really like the idea of it. Because it's a super intense, like you said, big band swing. Which kind of leans into that very organic quality that I like so much about this. And yeah, I do think that the idea of that against the really chromatic riffs and the really exaggerated vocal performance is something akin to, like, when we talk about Cryptopsy perverts these, like, major key melodies with all the surrounding context to make it something kind of sickening. It's like, that being said, this is also supposed to be music you get stoned to and just like chill out to. So that's definitely part of it. Part of it is that it's party music. So, maybe that's one of the fundamental things is maybe. Actually, I think that is it's like the parties you go to don't have people playing slam, whereas I'm at parties regularly where people are playing slam on the stereo, So it's sort of a cultural difference in a way.
It definitely has to do with like weed too, right? Like
smoking a lot of weed really helps.
I definitely have played like Beatdown at parties, right? Or like Doom Death. I played Temple of Void at a party, right? But like this is obviously pretty late at night, but slam. So like when that happens, are you doing the slam dance where you're like in the gym shorts and you hop around like a goblin from one foot to the other?
No, it's more like I'm really stoned on the couch and I just like lift my arm up and just like wave it down like House of Pain style to the rhythm. That's more.
And are you just kind of like laughing maniacally?
Oh yeah, no, you're supposed to laugh. You're supposed to laugh at sinister glee at like how simultaneously goofy and how gross it sounds. That's part of the pleasure of this music, I think.
Okay, well, I see, I hear all slam as being like that, so this carries it to such an extent that it just no longer computes to me. I'm like, but it does sound like a nursery rhyme. And as direct evidence for that, that's also a tendency you get in certain kinds of hip-hop influenced music now, right? It's just around, right? Yeah. But like, Jugular Constrictor, featuring Kirill Zarubin from Traumatomy.
From Adam A. Grant.
I'm gonna go for the mega autism and be like, see, doesn't this sound exactly the way I'm saying? This is a short sample. Okay, I transcribed the last vocal pattern. It is get you go, get you go, get you go, go.
Yeah,
it's like great. Cartman. It's like Cartman singing a lullaby to a baby, like Cartman tickling a baby.
I totally get what you're saying. Yeah, because you'd reference this when we did our bonus episode where we talked about devourments molesting the decapitated, about how they're almost like nursery rhyme rhythms. And yeah, no, you're correct. And then if you want to like tie that,
but I liked that album.
Yeah, which is interesting because it seems like a lot of the things you don't like.
Did I say nursery rhyme rhythms about that one?
Yeah, you did.
Was it the rhythms or something about the lyrics?
The vocal patterns, specifically the rhythmic vocal patterns, which I get. But to tie it to the more probable influence, I think the point of convergence is more like, I mean, it's not what it's intended to be, but what it sounds like is very old school hip hop, like original dance hall stuff. We're talking about like DJ Jazzy Jeff, Sugar Hill Gang type stuff.
Oh, yeah, there's some like Eric B and Rakim stuff that's kind of like that.
Yeah, it's like it's more funk than hip hop proper, but I think they're usually getting the ideas from hip hop.
Well, it plays better in that stuff. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of that stuff either, but it makes more sense there to me. There's also this thing there back of like showmanship, right? Like a hippity hip and a hippity hop and a wee bop ba doop bop bee dop bop, right? And here it's like, I don't know, man. Okay, so I guess the point is I get what's going on and I don't... I see what you kids are up to and I don't like it.
Get off my lawn.
Get off my lawn!
We listen to Hellhammer in this house.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Get off my lawn.
Okay, so I'm going to get to my last sample. I've kind of like made my case. The handful of people who listen to our show who are like weird deep cut slam fans will probably have already bought this. Like I know a few of them in the Discord already. We're going to go to Impure Gangrene Embalming. And I think that something we could probably agree on is that we haven't really talked about it yet. It's that the drum performance on this record is fantastic. This guy has a really unique, very musical style of drumming. Again, extremely similar to, his name unfortunately escapes my memory, but the drummer from Digested Flesh, who also used a lot of very distinctly kind of funk-based syncopation. But this guy's tying it together with Cephalotripsy's kind of propensity for these super tight, really like claustrophobic feeling snare fills. If you listen closely to the drum tracks, there's tons of fascinating stuff going on across this whole record. And this section off this track, I think, is going to show that off a lot. So that's a good example of, honestly, the thing that I like the most across this record, which is just the layers of rhythmic interplay. Because here, vocally, you can hear, it's a little less sing-songy, it's a little bit more like full-fledged hip-hop rhythm. You know, it's not just a loop of a single, yeah.
Usually the vocals oppressively double the guitars, is part of the weird thing about this record that I don't get. Here, there's a lot more interplay going on, and it's definitely more engaging.
Yeah, and I think that's, typically the structure you see in slam is that you play a riff 4 times, like a slam riff 4 times, and then the vocals are kind of doubling up the guitar twice, and then they'll, like, go off on their own in a more kind of hip-hop inspired flow on the back, too. But here, he's just cutting across everything. And then you combine that with the very interesting stuff the drummer is doing. A lot of it's pretty quiet, but he's doing these strange little, like, flam fills, like, mid-line in a lot of these riffs. Really cool stuff. And then if you listen to this almost like it's, what would you even call it? Like a sort of like more sophisticated styles of electronic stuff where it's all about rhythmic interplay between different timbral voices. I think it starts to make a little bit more sense, because even as a guy who listens to slam and actually cares about the construction of slam riffs, and there is interesting stuff in that regard on this record, for me, it's about the rhythms, man. It's about the way this record ebbs and flows, the juxtaposition of these different rhythmic figures, and all the while this feeling that it's like, it's hot. It's in a hot little practice space, and the two of them are just bouncing off of each other forever.
How's it going? Connor here from Oncology, and you're listening to Terminus.
Alright, wrapping up our evening, we go even further down the rabbit hole of gore with Lymphatic Phlegm's roughly excised Putrefindings, Morbidescriptions, and Necronoses. Again, released on a longtime label of the band, Black Hole Productions. Very cool, kind of gore grind and death metal label from Brazil. Been around forever, just plugging away in the underground. Lymphatic Phlegm is a pretty special band for me. I've been listening to them for about half my life now, which is very weird to say out loud. And Lymphatic Phlegm is a goregrind 2-piece who play a very unique style of goregrind. And I think that, I've got my ideas about it, but I think for the sake of people who aren't necessarily into the style, it would be better for you to describe it, because I assume that this is your first experience with these guys.
Yeah, well, before we go any further, I need our listeners to know that the Death Metal Guys Death Metal Crit is so good that we're getting YouTube recommendations on our channel for correct way to adjust the chain tension on your chainsaw. Your chain tension is wrong.
There we go. All right, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, gotta work on your technique before your next spree. So. Lymphatic Phlegm. Yes, this is a name I've heard from you before. Maybe a name that I thought was bigger than they were because you like them, right? But apparently this is kind of a cult band. It's really good. First of all, it's there's been goregrind stuff you've showed me that I've liked a reasonable amount. I really like this. I might listen to this again. If it reminds me of anything that we've covered on the show, it really reminds me of the Swarm record we covered a little while ago. The
I can see that.
Yeah, the extremely, I think the key word we always used is unhinged Japanese screamo that is rooted in rooted in sources that are unusual. It sounds kind of like grindcore, kind of like black metal. It's really this grinding screamo type stuff that's big in Japan. But the melodic ideas are really coming from outside metal or hardcore, right? In kind of like Japanese pop music and cabaret and sort of like punk, especially like jangly 77 punk type stuff, straight up emo stuff, just like rock and roll. Just a vocabulary that's very, very alien to extreme music with tones that are much cleaner than we're used to. And different kinds of dynamics in the songs. Similarly, Lymphatic Phlegm definitely play goregrind. And the riffing style here is, well, the guitar tone is maybe watery, would be a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
Sort of emphasizes the high end, but not clanging or piercing or keening. It's more watery, lots of reverb, and it's sort of, it sounds like, and a lot of the riffing ideas do not sound like they're coming. You can hear that outlines of riffs are inspired by patterns from thrash and maybe from hardcore or grind, but a lot of the riffs themselves have the note choice and the guitar tone and even the way the guitar interacts with the bass are coming from a different genre. Do you want me to get into it now?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about my theories about this band. I think that, it's hard to tell because reading interviews with Lymphatic Phlegm, they seem completely unaware that they're different. They're very earnest about how, we just listened to Carcass and like other goregrind bands around here in Brazil and classic death metal stuff, and yeah, I mean, if you think it's different and unique and you like it, I mean, that's cool, but we're just doing what we know. But to describe it, what I hear a lot of is very traditional heavy metal, like obviously blurred out into tremolo riffs, but traditional heavy metal and a lot of just kind of neoclassical stuff, or it's the arrangement of notes that Lymphatic Phlegm plays has very little to do with what you would assume, the sort of like very grinding, chromatic, ugly stuff that's typically associated with goregrind. Instead, a lot of this is very pretty, very almost medieval in a sense. A lot of these, like, transported would be black metal riffs in a different context. Bam? No?
As the black metal guy, I've got to say, and the medieval guy, I've got to say, not so much.
Okay.
Halfway through the record, partway through the record, I start to get some riffs that really do sound like you're describing. They sound like, okay, this sounds a little like a classical or Baroque thing. We'll get to some of them, and I'll try to point out how they're different from the other ones. And maybe a little bit... medievally didn't really jump out to me. But a lot... and some of them... the heavy metal thing makes sense to me. For sure. Like, there's like a speed metal-y stuff happening here. I just said thrash, but speed metal is maybe a better reference point. I think...
Well, it's very melodic throughout. That's one of the main points we're making.
Yeah, very based in sort of... but not like... In standard minor scale stuff, but not really sort of noble Dorian scale stuff. It sounds more... snaky and sinister. Sometimes has a kind of Latin feel to it. I know that You know, Brazil is obviously Portuguese influenced rather than Spanish, but there's some sort of maybe like intervals that remind me almost a little of flamenco type stuff, just generally. But it really sounds like goth. And it's even in the guitar tone, the sort of simple, often they're very simple 3 or 4 note kind of spooky sounding melodies that are interacting with rumbling bass. Do you want to start with your sample, or should I try to point out something really gothy?
Let's go with yours, and just kind of continue that thread.
All right. So this is causa mortis, transarterial chemoembolization. I wonder if these guys are doctors, like literally doctors.
I don't think they are, but that would be very cool.
Yeah, they're sort of like good-looking, clean-cut dudes. We did well at school and we stayed true to goregrind. And with that, let's grind. Yeah, so that riff at the end, I can't remember the exact notes, but the 6-note thing, right? Those intervals are closer to the sort of neoclassical black metal-y thing you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I was specifically thinking of almost like a guitar interpretation of like the simple cello loops of, Vivaldi or something, underneath the leading violin lines.
Oh, yeah. So it's like, I get that. It's been sort of rhythmically, it's very weirdly inflected rhythmically, right? It doesn't really have classical rhythmic quality to it. It's sort of cubist. It's like cubed. Darn, 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 darn. But I hear that there, right? That sort of motion, there's it's minor key, but we're sliding between different chords in a key signature. You could hear that being used in early second wave black metal too, or something like that. I get that. But the riff before then, which they sit on for a long time, which is oh
man, I love when that solo just dives in. It's so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that just is like a goth riff. It really sounds it sounds a little more rock and rolly than you might normally expect. It sounds like a cluster of goth bands we don't reference as much on this show. So usually we're talking about stuff like Killing Joke or Fields of the Nephilim or maybe Joy Division that are more directly relevant to a lot of what's happening in black metal now and just to metal in general. This is more like sort of death rock bands from like, especially that term really comes to exist for like Christian death from LA. And the funny thing is like Christian death, there are parts in Bauhaus that sound like this too in this tone. And there are parts of the Birthday Party, which you could also call death rock, which like the Birthday Party they kind of have this cowboy western kind of thing in it. Christian death kind of does too, and Christian death is from LA, so there's maybe even a little bit of like Latin music in there too. And there's like rock and roll and like not extreme metal, but even heavy metal. Christian death has become cool in the last 10 years thanks to Blogspot, but they were reviled by the people who really liked post-punk and would like talk about Bauhaus or Joy Division.
Okay.
Christian death was seen as like,
I was just going to say, is that like internal scene politics stuff, or what's the rationale for that?
Yeah, like before, the word goth was a dirty word for a long time, and even with people, people didn't think of Joy Division, they would call Joy Division a post-punk band, they would, maybe people who liked cool post-punk would also say they liked Bauhaus, who were a goth band, but people would avoid using that word, or would sort of say it apologetically, right? The Cure was sort of like post-punk or whatever. If you told people you liked goth, including people who liked music a lot, right? They look at you confused. I've said that on the show a few times. But Christian death was seen as beginning of sort of face paint, flamboyant, sort of showy, goofy goth. It's now become very cool, but it was not back in the day. I'm going to see if I can find a relevant Christian death sample for this, because the guitar tone and the intervals and the bass are just way too similar. So give me a second.
Okay.
All right, wait. I cancel that. I mean, the Christian death guitar tone is really similar, but in terms of the melodic idea, there's some stuff on Only Theater of Pain that sounds like this, but the melodic idea, I just found it on Prayers on Fire by the Birthday Party. So we are going to listen to Yard, which is a song in which Nick Cave on heroin yells horrified lyrics about chickens. He is terrified of the chickens. This is it would be fair play for you to compare this to 357 Homicide, right? Like, the idea that I as a teenager attempted to take this seriously is very funny. I mean,
it seems deliberately goofy in a way.
Oh, it is. I mean, I usually skipped this track also, but yes, it is. Yeah.
All right. Well, so getting on to another sample, Grave Wax Mortuary Fat. This is a really good song. This is in the upper echelon of Lymphatic Phlegm songs. So, reading your notes, your whole reference point to goth rock really messed with my perspective. And it was really interesting. And I think we'll hear a lot of these goth ideas you're mentioning on this track. And, but then I stick with a lot of these kind of theatrical classical ideas as well. Because, the guitarist of this band, let me look up his name again. Rodrigo Alcantara. He's apparently, based on an interview I've read, he's a Catholic, so I'm wondering if some of this is weird interpretations of, maybe hymnal music or old chants or something like that. So let's listen to this short track and see what we can pull from this one. So I guess more specifically, I was kind of mistaken when I said classical. I think what I'm thinking of when I talk about like medieval classical, I'm thinking of more like Gregorian chant in the way some of these melodies are arranged. But also something we have to draw attention to, and I know we will on later samples, is how much the actual guitar tone and production influences the structure of these riffs. So obviously, Lymphatic Phlegm, one of their trademarks has been that very midsy guitar tone just soaked to the gills in reverb and delay. Mm-hmm. And you'll hear that, this massively extended reverb and delay kind of like ends up looping in on itself and kind of changes the fundamental way some of these riffs are played. And in kind of the middle riff of that track, you'll hear a little stop at the end, and the stop keeps like moving backwards in time as it sequences over the blast beat. Like the reverb and the delay are looping in on themselves and cutting it earlier and earlier and starting the riff again earlier and earlier, which creates this... Lymphatic Phlegm is the only goregrind band I've heard that I would describe as dreamy or oniric. And that's such a fascinating quality for a band in this style to me.
Yeah, for sure. Gregorian chant, I would... that's a tough sell for me. I mean, I take your point that you could hear a Gregorian chant singing some note... Da, 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 da. Something like that. I get that, but you'd have to show me a more close comparison. It's yeah, I mean, so yeah, on that sample, I don't know. I really like the breakdown.
Well, we'll make you a goregrind guy yet.
Well, also the drumming under that breakdown is really cool, and we haven't talked about.
I mean it's a drum machine, but their programming is very interesting.
Very free double pedal type stuff. Like, are we hearing more of that lately? People using kind of programming or playing double pedal bass in ways that are a lot more fluid.
I think at this point, it's a combination of a couple things. One, drum programming software has become way more sophisticated and is a lot easier for people to use these days. I mean, I'm a guy that's done a couple records on an old Alesis SR16 for those in the know, so I've done the hard way. So one, it's more accessible, and two, I think more people nowadays are exposed to drum machine bands that are using the drum machine as an asset rather than a replacement for a drummer. Because Lymphatic Phlegm, with the specific way their music's constructed and the way the riffs kind of loop in on themselves with that very exaggerated delay and reverb, I don't think it would really work with a human drummer. There's this interesting interplay between the organic and the inorganic in their music, which I think is important to the atmosphere. But all in all, yeah, I do think we're hearing more sophisticated programming and more people who understand the drum machine as an instrument unto itself.
I'm trying to figure out what we were listening to lately that had a really cool rolling kind of flammy double bass. Yeah, it was the Antediluvian.
Yeah.
So on one end of the spectrum, we've got Mars Sekhmet just doing her like crazy fucking thunderous double pedal tom stuff that just sort of like flows kind of arrhythmically under the riffs, right? Or just free rhythmically, rather. And on the other hand, we've got these guys, and I thought the drumming was very organic. Because with these strangely looping rolls, I did not register that it was a drum machine.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, partly that's because I'm an idiot, and also because I'm you have a better ear for production. But the way it was playing is sort of like sounded sort of like that kind of flowing, very free double pedal stuff. I mean, it was almost a little Capricornus-y. In the sort of like tumbling, rumbling vibe. So it's pretty cool that they're doing that with a drum machine, and that maybe that organic sound to me is coming through because of the way it's interacting with the guitar.
I can see that. I think that maybe what you're hearing there is the subtle undercurrent of a kind of Latin influence. You know, because like even a lot of this, a lot of the guitar work on this record is just straight tremolo, but the places that the notes change tend to have a little bit of swing to them, tend to have a little bit of an almost off-time feel, but it always snaps together on the one, which, again, does lead back to that kind of flamenco or salsa feeling that you were talking about hearing.
I think as far as the thing that's not goth, like, I could be wrong about goth. I think as far as the thing that's not goth, it's really got to be some sense of... Latin guitar melody. You know, I am not a Brazilian music expert. Obviously, the best known stuff from it is like, Bossa Nova and Tropicalia. This does not sound like that, right? But it just does sound like, some sort of like Latin jazz sounds like that. A lot of the chord changes on this are like Latin jazz changes.
Well, I mean, we keep talking on the show about how much cool stuff there is in metal in South America, and how those regional influences can bleed into extreme metal styles and create really interesting ideas, and this is just another part of that.
Yep.
But yeah, no, I appreciate what you're saying about the idea of these... Yeah, no, definitely the chord changes, some of the arrangements of these riffs are radically different from what we're used to. Not just within metal, but specifically within goregrind. I mean, even the guitar playing. It's difficult to tell with a blown-out production, but I don't even know if there are chords used on this record. Everything might just be single-note arrangements. Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting stuff. But you've got a sample with one of the coolest titles of all time. So
I do. This one is Magnin's Decomposer Squad, The 8 Toilers of the Dead. Starts out with a pretty classic sample. Yes, indeed. So before, you may think that this is the 8 Toilers of the Dead sounds like it's fucking Nile lyrics. Right, that sounds like it comes from a cartouche. But no, like everything else, it seems to come from an anatomy textbook, or a true crime thing or something. So, starts with a classic sample. Usually I skip the samples, but couldn't do it this time because it actually sets up the song.
The researchers focus on details that would revolt most people, such as blackened skin, an important clue in establishing time of death. The darker the flesh, the longer the body's been dead. The first flies will arrive within half an hour of death and invade the body. Inside the body, the flies lay eggs, and 24 hours later, the eggs produce these slithering, flesh-eating insects, maggots.
So the trem riff, the ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, that definitely has a classical chord change thing to it that is kind of like Vivaldi for sure, or like, I guess, Baroque music.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it's this very simple kind of scale phrase, or like a fragment of a scale, and yet, again, it leads into the way the guitar tone and the production alters the sense of these riffs, because you hear it like hitching, catching up with itself at the end of each of those phrases. It's really fascinating. It's this is one of those rare bands where you cannot divorce the songwriting from its production. They're one and the same. It would not be Lymphatic Phlegm without that very strange production style. It's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think your next sample is the best example of that, but I do just want to say, the breakdown there.
Oh, it's so cool.
So, I think I'm getting more what's going on is that there's a melodic sensibility that these guys take for granted from Latin America, and maybe also just from like punk rock stuff, and that's in goth rock too, and it's coming from the same places. That is, the sense of spooky that gets in Christian Death or in The Birthday Party is in large part coming from minor scale ideas in rock and roll.
Yeah,
that are being exaggerated and drawn out, and those have to do with Latin music and surf music, and this also sounds like surf guitar.
Yeah, it's definitely got that surf guitar. I mean, it's basically a sort of like thrash metal structure, but the right hand playing is so languid. It doesn't have the percussive quality of a thrash riff.
No, I mean the rhythmic thing there. That breakdown could be a Birthday Party riff. Like they'd play it on the bass, they'd lead with it on the bass, but like it pretty much could be. And yeah, the way they turn that into a thrash riff is super cool. So yeah, that part's awesome. But your last sample is just a great example of how like the riff is written for the tone. These tones, you could write the riff without it, but it would the melodic contour of the riff is made with the tone, like stretched in between the notes. Like you couldn't write the riff the way it is. This combination of tones in time wouldn't make sense without the tone. So like I think this is just like a very beautiful part of the record.
Yeah. So kind of wrapping this up, the final sample comes off of a song called Unveiled, the Mortified Visceral Puzzle Pieces. And so, great title, obviously. And something you pointed out in the notes is that, I mean, you said there's very few, but in reality, I think there's 0 grind riffs as we understand them. There's nothing like Napalm Death. There's really nothing like Carcass, apart from, like, certain flourish ideas from some of their solos early on the first couple records. It's a goregrind record that has... Oh, go ahead.
There's a couple things that sound like hardcore riffs, but so only in the sense that like grindcore sounds somewhat like hardcore, right? But
yeah.
Even those, it's not like it's a dead ringer for hardcore stuff.
Yeah, in a sense, this is a record that is unmistakably goregrind, but has no conventional goregrind riffs. There is nothing like Last Days of Humanity or Regurgitation or anything like that. It's completely unique unto itself. And this track, Unveiled, is, like you said, it's a perfect example. This is a set of riffs that rely on the tone within which they are played. And just listen to the way the reverb and the delay echoes these sort of ghost harmonies into following repetitions of the riff, and it's a really exquisite track, I think. So yeah, as you said, those riffs, I mean, you might get some of the effect, but you won't get the full effect without the way the reverb and the delay smear the riff across itself. These harmonies emerging from the echo lasting too long and intersecting the riff into itself. And again, what's fascinating is reading interviews with these guys over the years. They seem to have no conception as to their production being different or being unusual. You know, it's perfectly natural to them. They see themselves as a logical continuum, maybe even unexceptional in goregrind. But you can just listen to that and be like, oh my god, there's something completely unique, an entirely different conceit.
Only band I mean, that's a place where the harmonic complexity in those riffs both sounds like kind of newer black metal stuff.
Yes.
Like the last riff, that, you know, yeah, there was the fascinating reverb riff, and then the last riff that's riffier, just steps up between, has different chord shapes in it, but steps up from minor to major chords in places they're really not, you don't expect to hear them. Right?
Yeah.
It's a riff made out of a unexpected sequence of simple minor and major intervals to make something complex, weird, and beautiful. Right?
Yeah.
And that's very black metal. The only band I've heard that writes reverb stuff like that riff that's built for the reverb is Devilgroth.
Yeah. Like, they're accessing really sophisticated black metal ideas from totally outside that style, but arriving at similar locations. And I'd like to mention, one of the things that's so cool about Lymphatic Phlegm is that some of these riffs, they're so kind of short and so based off of simple scales. They have this wonderful naivete in the good sense that we talk about on this show. You know, these wonderful, like, simple ideas that have this almost like childlike glee to them, you know, just like simple, like a child's Baroque melody delivered in this really gross, weird context. And that's great. But we're not going to play a sample of it. The final track on this record, Shedding of Necrotizing Cells, Pustule Eradication in Fits of Insanity, Part 2. The back half of that song is dominated by this incredible, flourishing neoclassical solo. Really the only one on the record, which is so sophisticated and so technically developed, it's almost like the punchline at the end of the record. That through all of this simplicity, through all of this, like, naive elegance, there was a guy with incredible instrumental talent and creativity behind it. And that is a wonderful joke that we can all be in on.